Okay, good morning. Can I say y'all? Do people say that in Virginia? Yes. Yay, I'm from the Midwest originally, and now I live in New York. I'm at Cornell University. I'm so happy to be here because last week we got 18 inches of snow, and it closed down our schools for 2 days. And we're used to snow, so normally it doesn't close us down. But so I'm bragging about the weather to my colleagues back home. Okay, so I direct the Controlled Environment Agriculture program at Cornell, which has about a 30-year history of studying hydroponic vegetable production. Obviously, I haven't been there that long. I've been with the group for about 9 years now. So I'll give a couple talks today. The first one is going to be about edible crop nutrition. Okay, we got it. Thanks, Joyce. So fertilizer recipes and also all about water and water quality. So Chris's talk was an excellent segue into this, so giving you some background on the different systems, and then this is going to be somewhat more technical, but it'll be great, and then we'll get to see it all in practice this afternoon too. So one of the things that's important if you have a business or you're starting a hydroponic business is to get your water tested by a commercial laboratory. And some of the things that we're really interested in is actually not so much pH, that's really easy to test, but just your water pH is just kind of a snapshot. It doesn't really tell us about its underlying properties. So related to that, alkalinity is what we're more interested, the carbonates and bicarbonates in your water. If you're used to growing in fields, it's kind of like the limestone that's in your water. And it's going to have this long-lasting pH effect, driving up your pH. Then electrical conductivity, which we'll also learn how to measure this afternoon with a simple handheld sensor, is a measure of the total salts. And so that tells you, just in general, is it a relatively pure water source? And then specific elements, so calcium, magnesium are plant-available things that we're interested in, versus sodium and chloride are things we don't necessarily want, but we want to know if they're in there so we can adjust our water practices from that. And you have handouts from me, so you don't have to rapidly write this all down. In terms of general water quality guidelines, I like this. This actually comes from the greenhouse world for growing bedding plants and potting plants, but I think it works well for hydroponics. So suggested, again, the pH isn't particularly important, but the alkalinity is. And ideally your waters are going to be about 100 parts per million or less calcium carbonate. Often they're more like 200 or 300. And this problem you can actually solve pretty well. We'll talk about adding acid to your water to neutralize the alkalinity. Then you have the other values, so electrical conductivity, less than 1, and we'll learn more about the units this afternoon. Sodium and chloride less than 70 parts per million, sulfates less than 90, boron less than half, fluoride less than 1, and iron less than 5 parts per million. Sometimes people will have relatively high iron or sulfur in their water, and they get kind of smells and visual issues related to the water that kind of affect how we use the water in our household. Like growing up, my house had really high iron in the water, and so it would stain my hair, it would stain our white clothes, so we had to use iron out in our, when we were washing whites in our laundry. But it doesn't affect plants, so plants can handle quite high amounts of iron, and it's a plant essential nutrient. And just like sulfur, that kind of rotten egg smell, plants will not care about that at all. Then I told you we're not really interested in the pH of the water that's our water source, but we are interested in the root zone pH, which is the interaction of the water source that we're using and its alkalinity, the fertilizers that we use, so we can use ammonium or urea-based fertilizers to decrease the pH, or nitrate-based fertilizers to increase the pH, as well as if you are using a potting mix, so in some hydroponic systems, you're using maybe coconut coir or perlite, which can affect slightly the pH as well too. I wanted to give you a little bit more about alkalinity, which is this is the liquid limestone in your water. And it's somewhat related to water hardness. Water hardness is the calcium and magnesium in your water. And the more calcium and magnesium you have in your water, the harder it is to get suds, and you need to use more soap. So that's why they call it hard water. So this is the other half of the calcium and magnesium. It's the carbonates and bicarbonates. Don't confuse it with the term alkaline, which just means pH greater than 7. So that can be kind of confusing. A laboratory will report it back to you typically in parts per million of calcium carbonate. Does anybody know the alkalinity of their water? Usually it's 50 to 500 parts per million. In New York, what I found is close to the coast, people have very pure waters, and it's maybe on the order of like 50. And then in central New York, we have a lot of limestone deposits in the ground, so people's wells are often in contact with that, and they have high alkalinity, maybe like 200 or 300 parts per million. So if you have high alkalinity, you could always change your water source, like collecting rainwater and using that or blending that. You can also use an acidic fertilizer, so using a more ammonium-based fertilizer. And also the thing that's most commonly done is adding some acid to the irrigation water. And so what we'll do is, so we use these fertilizer injectors to take a concentrated fertilizer solution or a concentrated acid, and then add them to our water source. So usually, often it's like a 1 to 100 or 1 to 200 ratio. And so what happens when we add acid is the hydrogen ions from the acid combine with the carbonate or bicarbonate, that's the alkalinity in our water, and it gives us carbon dioxide, which is just a little bit of gas that bubbles off, and a little bit of H2O. So it effectively gets rid of the carbonates and bicarbonates and makes the alkalinity not a problem. If you then have your water tested and you know what the alkalinity is, we can then actually calculate how much acid you need to add. And so Joyce would be a great reference for that here in Virginia. There's a really nice online tool at the University of New Hampshire. And so you plug in the alkalinity of your sample, your target alkalinity. Often we don't want to drop it down to 0. We want a little bit of buffering left behind, so like 50 or 80 parts per million calcium carbonate is our target. And then you can choose which type of acid. And then you hit submit, and it will tell you, so if you have a 1 to 100 injector, we need to use 1 fluid ounce of that sulfuric acid per gallon of concentrated stock solution. So it's a really, really nice, simple tool. The main acids that we will use would be sulfuric acid, nitric acid, phosphoric, or for organic growers, they will often use citric acid. Some citric acids that are naturally prepared can be used in certified organic production. Citric is a weaker acid, so also if schools are using, like if you're just kind of using it on a hobby scale, you'll see like schools or homeowners using citric acid. It's a powder that's relatively easy to add. Because it's weak, it's relatively safe. It's also, if you were a commercial grower though, it's going to be the most expensive acid because you have to use a lot of it. So sulfuric tends to be the cheapest and the one that I see most commonly used. Nitric acid is sometimes used because it also gives you nitrogen, so a plant essential element, and you can reduce the amount of nitrogen in your fertilizer recipe. The problem with nitric acid is its fumes are relatively caustic, so you have to use it in a well-ventilated area. Otherwise it can cause problems with inhalation. And with all of these acids, there are still safety things that you have to be aware of, right? So you add acid to water, not pouring water on top of acid. Do it slowly over time so it doesn't heat up too fast. Wearing eye protection and gloves. Some people will also use phosphoric acid, and it provides phosphorus. But what we find is it almost provides too much phosphorus. So if you're neutralizing more than about 100 parts per million alkalinity, you're getting way more phosphorus than the plants actually need just from the phosphoric acid. So sulfuric tends to be the most common. So in general, if you tested your water and you find you're kind of above the limits, like for sodium and chloride and for alkalinity, there are some different methods for correcting poor quality water. Oh yeah, and I like this photo because there's no silver bullet. Any solution is going to have some expense associated with it. So you might consider changing your water source. Maybe you have a well at your facility, but you're also on municipal water. So if the municipal water source had higher quality, it might actually make sense to pay to use that municipal water source. Some people will use pond water. There can be pretty severe issues with root-borne pathogens that can be spread from surface waters. So then you're typically installing a filtration system to disinfect that water before you use it. Rainwater is a really high quality water source. Reverse osmosis water is often used. And I'll talk more about open and closed irrigation. Closed irrigation is if you're in a hydroponic system where you're capturing and reusing all of your water and trying to reuse it as much as possible. If you have an open irrigation source, is maybe you're growing tomatoes in pots with perlite in them, and you let the excess water drain out of the bottom of the pot and just run off to the ground, and you're not capturing and reusing it. If you're growing in a closed irrigation system where you're capturing and reusing the water, water quality becomes more important, because if you start with a little bit of sodium and chloride in your water and you keep adding fresh water to that which has more sodium and chloride, it's going to build up and accumulate over time. So if you want to grow in like a pond lettuce system, for example, and reuse that water for many months, you may have to start with reverse osmosis water. I also wanted to give an example of so reverse osmosis water is what we're kind of most familiar with using, where there are filters that essentially push pure water through the filters, and then the brackish or salt water stays behind, and then that's just wastewater. At Cornell, the professors before my time built about a 6,500 square foot hydroponic lettuce greenhouse. And what they found is that using the municipal water source year after year after year, that they saw kind of yields decline over time, which they thought were these imbalances, like the sodium and chloride accumulating over time, other things getting out of balance. So they decided they needed to filter their water before they used it. They looked into a reverse osmosis system, and it would have cost several $1,000s as kind of their upfront cost. But the bigger issue for them is there's also a lot of wastewater. So maybe for every 1 gallon of pure water that you get from it, there's about 2 gallons of brackish water left behind. And they weren't connected to a sewage system or the municipal stormwater system, so they couldn't legally discharge that wastewater from their facility. So what they decided to do is install ion exchange demineralization. This can be set up by Culligan or water supply companies. Essentially, it has these two kind of large canisters. One of them, and they have resin beads in them. One of them will trap positively charged ions. One of them traps the negatively charged. So you capture all of the things in the water: the sodium and chloride, calcium and magnesium, and so on. In our example, it cost about $25 per month for the tank rental. And then every time you had to exchange the cartridges, because they're only good for so long, about $125 per recharge. So the facility at Cornell, that 6,500 square foot facility, was going through about 4,500 gallons of water every 10 days. So they had to do a recharge every 10 days. So for about $400 a month, they had a relatively pure water source, which worked out fine for that facility. One point I did want to make is not to use a water softener when you're growing plants. So what a water softener will do is it exchanges the calcium and magnesium and replaces it with sodium and chloride. So it's bad for plants. Like, it's good for changing your water for washing clothes, because it takes away the calcium and magnesium and makes suds work again, so you can get away with using less soap. But for plants, it's taking away plant essential nutrients, calcium and magnesium, and replacing it with sodium and chloride, which we don't want. So here's an example from near my neck of the woods. There was a university conservatory that had to use softened water, and they didn't have access to a different water source from their university. But we were able to test their water before the softener and after the softener. And what you can see is, so it took away the calcium, most of the calcium and most of the magnesium, which we wanted, and our plant available nutrients, and it gave us a lot more sodium in particular, which we did not want. So in their case, it was kind of funny. They ended up, because they couldn't change the situation with the water softener, they installed a small reverse osmosis system after that. So then they filtered their water that they gave to their conservatory plants. So I talked a little bit about water quality and closed irrigation systems versus open irrigation systems. So with these open systems, any excess water just leaches to the floor or to the ground. And this is nice for growers in that if you have salt buildup in the root zone, what you can do is just add more irrigation water to leach out or flush out those salts. So it helps you solve those problems with nutrient imbalances. Versus if you're in a closed system where you capture and reuse the water, it's going to be more important for you to monitor both the water quality to begin with, but then taking samples over time. So if you're growing in like a lettuce pond, the way that we would do it is every 2 weeks we would take pond water samples and send them to a commercial lab so that we could track the elements that were in there and adjust our fertilizer program so that we didn't have imbalances. Okay, so then I'll start talking more about specifics of developing a fertilizer program for your plants. And one of the points that I want to make is if you're mixing different fertilizers together, some of them you cannot mix together. I say they don't play nicely with each other, and the problem is incompatibility. So when you blend them together, they recombine and they form a sludge or a precipitate. And so this is just an example where at dilute amounts like that our plant would get, there's no problem combining these fertilizers, but in the stock tanks where they're at, say, 100 times or 200 times the concentration, this is where they form that sludge or precipitate. And if they form that sludge, unfortunately, those aren't gonna be soluble in water anymore and able to be taken up by the injector. So it's wasted fertilizer. A good rule of thumb is that we're not mixing calcium with phosphates or sulfates, and I'll give you more details on that in a minute. You can get from fertilizer companies these charts of which things are compatible with each other. So for example, here ammonium sulfate is not compatible with this aqua ammonium, but it is compatible with ammonium nitrate. So you can then look at charts like this to see which things you can blend or not. So because of this problem, we often use calcium nitrate as one of the base parts of our fertilizer solution. And then often it's not compatible with the other phosphates or sulfates that we want to add from the other fertilizer components. So because of this, we're typically using 2 stock tanks and 2 injectors. So one of them would be for the calcium nitrate, and one of them would be for the other fertilizer components. And then these are just connected in series. So once the fertilizer is taken up and diluted, it's not a problem combining with the other dilute fertilizer. So, and often growers will even use 3 tanks. So the first tank, often is tank A, is where they put their calcium nitrate. And you could also put in potassium nitrate with that. It's compatible, your iron chelate. If you needed to add acid to neutralize your alkalinity, nitric acid is compatible with the calcium nitrate in this tank A. Then in tank B, most of these other components go in there. So the other half of the potassium nitrate, and then all of these things that are incompatible with calcium nitrate. So the potassium sulfate, the monopotassium phosphate, magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salts, and so on. And if you were adding acid, if you're using sulfuric acid or phosphoric acid, it's compatible with these tank B fertilizers. But what I will find some growers do is use a third stock tank and third injector, and then that's the one that's reserved for their acid. So then they can put any of the acids in there. The nice thing about having a separate tank for this is if you find your root zone, like pH, keeps going up over time, you can just adjust the acid. You can add more acid to your tank C, or adjust the injector ratio to take out more of that acid solution. And then you can do that without impacting the kind of base fertility program that your plants are getting from tank A to tank B. In hydroponic crops, it's quite important to use greenhouse grade fertilizers, which are more expensive than field grade fertilizers, but they typically have higher purity and solubility. They're also more appropriate, so like an example with calcium nitrate is hydrophilic, like it grabs water that's in the air, and then kind of cakes up. And then you also don't know how much fertilizer you're getting versus how much water you're getting. And so for field applications, it's often kind of coated in this sort of greasy coating that makes these sort of beads of calcium nitrate, which works fine for field applications where it's spread from a fertilizer spreader. But if you dissolve it in a stock tank, it has poor solubility and you get this kind of greasy layer on top. So we want to use greenhouse grade calcium nitrate that's in sealed plastic bags. And so now I'll talk about some fertilizer recipes. The resource that I use is an article that I wrote myself along with Carrie Peters from the Peters Fertilizer Company. But it's quite similar to many of the other types of recipes that Chris has noted. And so what I will do is talk about nutrient recipes for leafy greens first, and then nutrient recipes for tomatoes or other vine crops such as cucumbers or peppers. And this article has this as well. So for many of these leafy greens and herbs, we can get away with using essentially the same nutrient solution, where during the propagation stage, we're using it at about 125 parts per million nitrogen. So it has all the other nutrients as well. But when we talk about how strong the fertilizer is, we list it in parts per million nitrogen. And then once we're in the kind of production stage, so once we've transplanted the seedlings into our ponds or NFT channels, then we're usually at a little bit stronger fertilizer solution. So usually 150 parts per million nitrogen for lettuce and 175 parts per million for basil. And some of the other crops that you can grow in an NFT system, like Swiss chard or kale or spinach, were usually also with a little bit stronger fertilizer solution. So then this would be an example of propagation. So these rock wool trays with about 200 cells per tray, and lettuce seeded into them. And then in this case, there's a drip irrigation system on a timer. So a few times a day, the lettuce gets fertilized with that. You can also just overhead water your lettuce, so they could be in flats on a bench, and you're overhead watering them. And these rock wool cubes, when the seedlings are young, they only need to be watered once a day, at least in our New York climate, maybe not in Virginia in the middle of the summer. And then by the time the seedlings get older, and they have about 3 or 4 leaves and they're getting close to transplant, you may need to overhead water them by hand like 2 or 3 times per day. But the rock wool holds plenty of water. So this would be basil in an NFT system. This was actually taken at Gotham Greens, which is a rooftop greenhouse in Brooklyn on top of a Whole Foods. And it's very funny to me, like the amazing thing is it's above a supermarket in Brooklyn, but once you're in the greenhouse, it's like any other like hydroponic greenhouse that you're in. So this article has recipes for leafy greens, And I'm going to talk about simple fertilizer recipes as well as a more complex recipe, and then talk about why you might want to use a more complex recipe in some applications. So there's everything from 1, 2, or 3 bag kind of simple recipes. So one example is Jack's Hydro Herb Feed, so 16-4-17. This is a 1 bag solution. So it has everything that these leafy greens need in 1 fertilizer bag. So you would use 355 grams, so not quite a pound, per 100 gallons of water. Or if you're using an injector, that's at a 1-to-100 ratio, so that means you'd use 355 grams of this fertilizer per 1 gallon in the stock tank. And this gives you that 150 parts per million nitrogen and the balance of other nutrients, which you would use for growing on lettuce. And then I'll compare this to some of the other fertilizer recipes in a minute. One of the things we find with this particular fertilizer is it doesn't have as much calcium or magnesium as other fertilizers, so it's kind of relying on your water to already have some calcium and magnesium in it, which works well if your water source does have that. If you have a very pure water source, then you might find you'll actually have to add more calcium and magnesium. So then moving one step up in complexity is using a 2 bag solution, and so this would be calcium nitrate, would go in tank A, so 284 grams per 100 gallons dilute, or per 1 gallon in a stock tank. And then you can find, so Jack's is an example, 5-12-26. You can find many of these kind of hydro feed fertilizers that have almost everything in them, except they don't have the calcium and nitrate because they're not compatible with that. So you have to use a separate stock tank and injector for those. So this is relatively easy. So you need 2 stock tanks and 2 injectors, and you need to buy 2 different bags of fertilizer. Another example of a hydroponic fertilizer in the market, and all of these examples I've given you are powdered fertilizers because they're a lot more cost effective than buying the quart or gallon jugs of liquid fertilizers that sometimes people will use at kind of the hobby scale for small systems at home, but they're a lot more expensive than using these powdered fertilizers. So Hort Americas has their 9-7-37. So it has most of the nutrients that are needed, except we need to combine it with calcium nitrate as well as magnesium sulfate. So what we do is we need 3 bags. So we get the Hort Americas 9-7-3, that goes in tank B at 150 grams. Then we need calcium nitrate, so that goes in tank A at 280 grams. And then we have our magnesium sulfate or Epsom salts, so that will go in tank B at 160 grams. Okay, and then if you want to get really complex, you can kind of mix everything by hand. So the Cornell CEA lettuce recipe that has worked very well for us for the past 20 years is called the Sonneveld solution, so invented by a Dutch researcher. And so this has something like 11 different fertilizer salts that you would need to buy and to mix up. So that the base of this fertilizer, there's still the calcium nitrate in tank A, and then a little bit of ammonium nitrate, or we could substitute that. Ammonium nitrate is kind of hard to get nowadays because of homeland security, so we can substitute like monoammonium phosphate or monoammonium monoammonium phosphate, which could go in tank B instead. Our potassium nitrate, and then our iron source. So we're using a chelated iron source instead of using iron sulfate. We use iron that's going to be soluble, more soluble in our water at higher pHs. And then tank B has other macronutrients, so there's nutrients that we need in pretty large quantities, the potassium phosphate, the magnesium sulfate, And then all of the other micronutrients, the things that the plants need in small quantities, get added to tank B as well. So, why do you think a grower might want to use this really complex recipe? Any guesses? Cost, yes, so that would be a biggie. So what we find is, it kind of depends on the scale of the grower, but the larger scale a grower is, they find that the economics kind of work out of mixing things for themselves and just buying the ingredients in bulk. The other thing that it gives you is more flexibility. It also takes more knowledge, but you can then, if you're growing in these lettuce ponds and testing the water every 2 weeks, and you see that like potassium keeps going down farther than it should be, you know you need to add more potassium to your fertilizer solution. Well, with these other recipes, anytime you would add potassium, it would be in this fertilizer, the kind of the hydrofeed fertilizer. You get all the other nutrients that you don't necessarily want along with it. So with a fertilizer program like this, you could add, you'd still have to get phosphorus with it in this case, but you could add more potassium phosphate to bump up your potassium that you need. So it gives you greater flexibility and the ability to respond to your plants. And I wanted to show this example of how they stack up to each other. So we had the simplest recipe here on the left to the most complex recipe on the right. The calculations I gave you, it was all to give 150 parts per million nitrogen, but then you can see how the other things stack up. So for example, calcium was really quite low in that single bag fertilizer recipe, so it relies on having more calcium in your tap water. Magnesium was also quite low compared to the others. And then the micronutrients actually stacked up pretty good, regardless of those fertilizer recipes. So we've actually tested some of these side by side. Last spring I had a student that tested the 1 bag solution versus the 2 bag versus the 3 bag for lettuce over 3 crop cycles, and we couldn't find any substantial differences in plant performance across those 3 crop cycles. Which is good, I guess, for you as the grower. You've got options. Okay, now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about fertilizer recipes for vine crops, so tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. And then this recipe is based off of a fertilizer recipe that's worked really well at the University of Arizona for their controlled environment agriculture program, because they have more experience with tomatoes than I do. And so what we find is if you're a fairly small scale grower, you can use the same fertilizer recipe for tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. If you become a bigger grower and you're really trying to get the last kind of 10% out of your crop yield, then it might be useful to have a specific cucumber recipe or a specific pepper recipe. And then with tomatoes too, it can also be beneficial to adjust the recipe over time as the crop ages. And I'll show you examples of that in a minute. So the base of this fertilizer, again, is calcium nitrate, so in a tank A. So we could use the Jack's Hydroponic plus calcium nitrate, so the Jack's Hydroponic in tank B. So this would be our 2 bag solution. We can't use a 1 bag solution because for these vine crops, it's absolutely essential to have higher calcium and magnesium than what lettuce and leafy greens and herbs require. And then if we want to have this more complicated recipe, again, that if you can buy things in bulk and mix it yourself, it can be cheaper, and you also have more flexibility. So again, it would be kind of like the lettuce example, but just with some different numbers here, because we do have higher calcium and potassium and magnesium in these vine crop fertilizer solutions. So let me show you how they stack up. So this University of Arizona recipe, we're supplying it at 190 or so parts per million nitrogen, about 40 or 50 parts per million phosphorus. Potassium is really needed as the crop goes into fruiting. And so our two-bag solution probably doesn't have quite enough potassium. They have very similar amounts of calcium and magnesium, and then the micronutrients were quite similar as well too. So what I find is for growers starting out, they would typically use that kind of one fertilizer recipe for their vine crops. But if they're starting to grow at a larger scale or starting to refine their growing system, then they might consider adjusting the fertilizer as the crop ages. So from the University of Arizona, we have a tomato stage 1 fertilizer recipe, which is from the seedling stage until you have the second truss of flowers, so the second cluster of flowers has open flowers. Tomato stage 2 would be from the second to the 5th cluster of flowers are in flower, and stage 3 would be from that 5th cluster until the end. And this stage 3 is actually this multi-crop recipe, which is what I gave you here. So what we do with, if we adjust it over time for tomatoes, is we start with lower nitrogen, because this will encourage more flowering. Have you seen this with tomatoes before or heard of this? If you overfeed tomatoes at first, they spend their energy growing more stem and leaf and not starting to flower. But if you give them less fertilizer to begin with, it kind of encourages them to start flowering and start fruiting earlier on. And then we also, so we move from lower nitrogen initially to higher nitrogen later. And then we also increase the potassium and calcium as they come into fruiting, because greater quantities of this are needed by the fruit. So this would be that multi-crop recipe that I showed you. And then just to demonstrate, so nitrogen would go from 90 parts per million at stage 1 up to 190 parts per million at stage 2. Potassium would be doubling from stage 1 to stage 3, and calcium increasing a bit as well too. The other components would be the same. Okay, and I get this question from often from growers starting out or starting at a smaller scale that only have one fertilizer injector and one stock tank on hand. And they say, what do I do? Because especially for these vine crops, I showed you these recipes where you have to have at least 2 stock tanks and 2 injectors. So if you only have one injector, what you could do is still have 2 stock tanks. So it could even be, a 5-gallon bucket for each of your stock solutions. And then you're just using one of them at a time. So you're alternating, so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they get the calcium nitrate. And for the other days of the week, they get the other hydrofeed fertilizer. The thing that I found, which I should have realized this from the beginning when I had my hydroponic production class do this last fall, is we also realized that we had to double the concentration of fertilizer that they were given, because they were only getting one of the components at a time. So over the course of the week, they'd only be getting half as much. So we had to double that fertilizer concentration, so that averaged over the course of the week, it was like they got kind of this continuous supply. Does that make sense? So we found this when my class, we started seeing nutritional problems in our tomatoes and measuring salt levels to kind of track the fertilizer concentration. And we're like, oh wow, it's really low, what's going on? And then we had to go back to the source and kind of figure that out. So I just have a few minutes left on the nutrition talk. Yes, 5 minutes. So we'll talk more about pH and EC this afternoon at Schuyler Greens. I'll have examples of these handheld pH and EC meters. In hydroponics, it's really important to measure root zone pH and salt levels at least every day. If you were growing container crops like bedding plants or potted plants, we're often only doing it like once a week or once every 2 weeks. But in hydroponics, because the potting mix that we're in is just a physical substrate, if we have one at all, and often we're in ponds or channels where we only have this water, pH can change very rapidly. So we're testing and adjusting at least every day. The optimum pH varies a little bit by crop, but in general, 5.5 to 6.5. And in hydroponics, 5.4 to 6 is really what we're looking for. And this is because nutrient availability depends on pH. So at high pH, At high pH, we don't have enough solubility of these micronutrients like iron and manganese and boron. This sounds like something my students would do in my class. So. And then I'll answer their phone for them. I'll say, hey, John can't answer the phone right now. He's in his hydroponic production course. Can I take a message? Who's this? This is his instructor, Professor Mattson. It's great. And then all the other students turn off their phones. So it is important to have this optimal pH. Also, at low pH, we can have problems with calcium and magnesium not being available. And EC is going to depend on the crop, but often it's kind of in the 1 to 2 to 3. So with lettuce, 1.5 to 2 decisiemens per meter, and for tomatoes and vine crops, it's often more like 2 to 3 decisiemens per meter. This was just an example from Ohio State University, or the Ohio State University, as they would say. So they did a study where they wanted to see how important was it to have pH either at a target of 5.4 or a pH of 6, and then this is fresh weight of heads of lettuce. And they found that they got about a 24% higher yield if they kind of religiously maintained pH at 5.4 instead of at pH 6. So helping that nutrient availability helped them get better yields out of it. Versus having a slightly stronger fertilizer solution. So an EC of kind of 1.4 is sort of our Cornell target fertilizer strength, versus an EC of 1.8, they found no difference. So the nice thing is in hydroponics, so long as you're supplying the nutrients, there's enough flow of water and enough reservoir of the nutrient solution, you can get away with a pretty wide range in electrical conductivity. So you can also, beyond having these handheld meters that you check at least daily, you could also get automated controllers. And I'm not sure what Schuyler Greens has, but we'll check it out. So you can get these kind of inline pH sensors. So for about $1,000, these sensors connected to a display that will measure like 24/7 pH and EC, and then they can use thresholds to turn on these pumps, either at a small scale with these peristaltic pumps or at a larger scale with these larger injectors. So then if EC levels get too low, so your fertilizer concentration's going down, it can pump in more fertilizer. And if your pH is getting too high, it can pump in more acid. So I think I will end there. There were a few more slides in your handouts that talk about diagnosing plant nutrient deficiency. So there's some good links to, again, articles I wrote because I like them, that have good pictures. But we'll also talk about diagnosing nutrient disorders later this afternoon at Schuyler Greens. So 1 minute for questions. Yes?
As far as the nutrient concentration and life of that over a period of time, I know you talked about sending it to a lab and have it tested. If you're monitoring the pH and EC and they're maintained properly, I guess other elements and other nutrients start to go up out of whack, so to speak.
So I've seen this with, like when I've operated an NFT system for my class, it was a pretty small water reservoir. It was only 100 gallons for a pretty decent sized NFT system. And we kept, we had these automated EC sensors and pH sensors, so it kept dosing in fertilizer as needed and keeping water always at 100 gallons of water. And what we found is after about 2 or 3 crop cycles, we started seeing nitrogen deficiency. So what was happening is the plants were using up more nitrogen than they were getting back from the replenished nutrient solution. So they were using up all of the nitrogen as soon as they would get it, and some of these other elements were actually added in larger quantities than the plant needed. So those were contributing to this high EC. So the nutrient doser thought my EC was fine, but I still didn't have enough nitrogen because it would get used up right away.
So the size of your nutrient tank, I know that one manufacturer told me I have 300 gallons and I got one that says 550 gallons. I mean, does that have an impact on that concentration?
Yes, right, it will. So the larger your kind of tank is, the more kind of buffering you have, which is why actually I really love the pond system for lettuce. So if you have like 10 inches of water, you've got, I think it's something works out to the math I've done, like more than 2 gallons a plant of nutrient solution. So it takes a long time for things to get depleted or to change rapidly, like they would in an NFT system. So there's no perfect answer, and so also you might find you have to do more like sending samples to a commercial lab as you first get used to a system, and then as you learn about the system, or even just using the visual symptoms of nutrient deficiencies to say, hey, I'm not getting enough nitrogen. So what I did at that point is I just had to drain or bleed some of the fertilizer water that had gotten old and out of balance, and replenish it with fresh water and fresh fertilizer, and that brought things under control again for a while. Yeah, way at the back.
If I have an hydroponic system, will I be able to use the same nutrient recommendation as a pool?
Yes, yeah, so the question is if you have like a small scale or a home hydroponic system or your own hydroponic system.
No, hydroponic, the one that...
Oh, aeroponic. Yeah, got it. Yes. Yeah, so aeroponics, there's, at least from my line of thinking, there's nothing magical or different about aeroponics. It's just a different way of bathing the roots with water and nutrients. So we use the exact same fertilizer recipes. With aeroponics, then you also have to be careful about filtering out any particulates from the water ahead of time. We still have to do that, like especially with NFP systems, so that our drip irrigators don't get clogged. But this is especially important with aeroponic systems where we have really small, like fog or mist nozzles that can get plugged up really quickly. So it's you can still use the same fertilizer recipes, but you have to be even more careful about salts kind of clogging those nozzles. Yes?
Is there a way to test for individual nutrients in the greenhouse?
Oh, that would be lovely, wouldn't it? If you have thousands and thousands of dollars, you can, yeah. There are also, you can get, like even from the pool industry, you can check nitrates with a little test strip or with the colorimetric method. They kind of give you a ballpark, so I would trust them to, like for nitrate, some of them to within maybe like plus or minus 20 parts per million, which at least tells you whether it's there or not, you know, so that might help out at least a little bit, yeah. But I don't, yeah, and so you just have to take what they say with a grain of salt, and then the like color changing things, they have an expiration date, so after a year or two, they're not as accurate anymore either. So you have to take that into account. All right, we'll hold it for there. I'll be around all day, so feel free to just come up and ask questions as well too. Oh yes.
You didn't get lettuce and light? No.
Lettuce and light. Yeah, I didn't get to quite all my slides, so but I think it's important to keep the program on time. So
Sorry.
we'll talk more about light in a little bit.